Inspired Parenting Radio Show with host Sandie Sedgbeer, where our mission is to inspire conscious parents, families, and educators by bringing you the latest research and thinking on supporting today's highly evolved children to fulfill their potential as healthy, confident, resourceful, and emotionally intelligent individuals.
Into the Inspired Parenting Radio Show. Parenthood is filled with joys and wonderful milestone moments, but there's one milestone that many parents face with fear and trepidation, and that's the onset of puberty, when the sweet children they knew and loved suddenly start transforming into mystifying, monosyllabic, moody strangers. There's no denying that for parents, the adolescent years can be intimidating, confusing, and anxiety-ridden. The behavioural changes that take place during this period strain even the strongest parent-child relationships, leaving both sides frustrated and begging a fundamental question: why do teens act this way? With me today to answer that question is a man who not only knows exactly what's going on with teenagers, but also knows how you can crack the code and transform one of life's most challenging periods into one of its most rewarding. Dr. Daniel J. Siegel is a renowned neuropsychiatrist and the best-selling author of a number of invaluable books on parenting, including Parenting from the Inside Out, The Whole Brain Child, Drama, Discipline, and the most recently published Brainstorm, The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain, which is widely regarded as essential reading for everyone who wants to better understand the teens in their life. Dr. Daniel Siegel, welcome to the Inspired Parenting Show.
Sandie, thanks for having me.
Dan, your book Brainstorm demonstrates that the teen years don't have to be filled with turmoil if parents are willing to crack that code of what's driving a teen's behaviour and if they can recognise the upsides. So let's start at the beginning and tell us what happens to a child's brain as they approach adolescence.
Well, you know, what's happening in an adolescent's brain is so fascinating. We didn't know this 10 years ago, but now we know the brain is doing something called remodeling. And what that means is it's changing its connections in some fundamental ways that an adolescent and a parent caring for an adolescent can actually affect in a positive way once you understand what's happening. Now,
one of the things that struck me when I was reading your book, and it is fascinating, I've got an 11-year-old grandson, and, I'm very curious to know how his behaviour is going to change at adolescence. So it's been quite a learning curve for me reading the book. But one of the things that I really made a big impact was that a 15-year-old isn't simply a 10-year-old with 5 years more experience. And right there, I think, is the big mistake that we all make.
That's exactly right, Sandie. You know, what people discovered was that, basically in the first dozen years or so of life, and it varies, of course, kid to kid, but around the first dozen years of life, so before you enter your adolescence, you're basically accumulating more and more connections in the brain. So the basic cells of the brain make connections with each other. And when that happens, you learn new skills, you learn new knowledge, you remember how to do your ABCs, how to do your mathematics. All the stuff you learn, you're accumulating more and more connections, and they become more intricate. So people thought, well, that probably just continues on, and you keep on learning more and more. Maybe it stops at the end of childhood and adolescence, but that's basically what that period of time is like before you're an adult. But what we discovered was surprising to everyone. You, yes, continue to make new connections, but another process begins in a really big way, which is the first part of it, is the first part of remodeling. It's called pruning, that the brain starts to remove intentionally connections that had been established. And even some of the basic cells, the neurons, become removed. And those that you don't use, you lose. So it's a use it or lose it principle. And this is why, now that we know this, if you want to learn a foreign language and speak it well, or learn a musical instrument or an athletic sport, or, learning some kind of art, you really want to take on some of those new skills before adolescence is over, for sure, when the connections can be made in the deepest kind of way possible. Of course, you can always learn things later on. It's just a lot more difficult. So the pruning is the first thing that surprised everyone.
So,
the second thing...
Sorry, go on.
ahead.
No, you go ahead, please.
No, the second thing is later in adolescence, you get this thing called myelinating. Now, myelin, M-Y-E-L-I-N, myelin, it's basically a sheathing that goes over connected neurons and allows them to communicate with each other 3,000 times, not just faster, but in a more coordinated and balanced way. So when you add the process of myelination, which happens at the end of adolescence, and you add that to the pruning, basically here's what you're doing to the brain. You're differentiating the brain, that is making areas more unique and distinct by removing the excess neurons that are there, like pruning a garden. But then you're creating the pathways that connect different regions of the garden to each other, and that's the myelin. And that's called linkage. Now, when you link differentiated areas, the word we use for that is called integration. And integration, it turns out, is a great thing, and it's what the adolescent brain remodeling is designed to do, to make a more integrated brain that's more coordinated and balanced, it's more functional, and it's actually the purpose of adolescent brain remodeling.
You say that their brains, as they reach adolescence, start processing information differently. It gets more complex.
Yes.
So how so?
Well, take, for example, remember your adolescence. When you were, let's say, when you were 14 or 15, Sandie, did you notice that you were thinking about yourself, about your friends, maybe even about life, differently than when you were 6 or 7?
Hard to remember that far back.
It is hard, I know.
Yes, I think so.
Well, your grandchildren are a little young to use them as an example because he's 11, but here's the idea, that the brain becomes more integrated, more complex in many ways. The differentiated regions and then the linking of those differentiated regions allows you to achieve new things like thinking in abstract ways. So for a child in the first dozen years of life, basically there's a lot of what's called concrete thinking. Things are thought of as, directly what they are. But ideas like freedom and justice and love and the meaning of life, and we all die at one point, what's the purpose of anything, grasping those existential issues of life is something that the adolescent brain begins to do, whereas a child's brain doesn't even think about that stuff, right? So that's one level of the change, is your capacity to think in more abstract terms about meaning and purpose and develop a more complex autobiographical sense of yourself, of who you are in relationship to your friends. And you can discuss these kinds of things. If you ever look at journals, like I have journals from back in my early adolescence, sometimes I look at them, I can notice that what I wrote when I was 12 was a lot different from what I wrote when I was 15. And these deep thoughts come from a changing brain.
So what's their sense of identity like before that then?
Yeah, well, that's a really, really great question. I mean, if we just take a step back and think about identity in general, when you say, what's your sense of identity? That's a big question. I just finished writing a book called Mind, where, one of the chapters of the book is about, who are we? And this idea of a sense of identity is actually a really deep question. So we know you're beyond childhood when you start asking the question. But sometimes kids do ask that, who am I? And for an adolescent, when you ask that question, it's something that has a lot to do with how do I fit in with my friends? Who am I as I emerge from my family? What is the direction I'm going to take as a person as I leave home and go out into the world, and what am I all about? What are the values I have? What is really something that gives meaning to me, and I'm going to pursue that, and something that doesn't give meaning to me, and I will let that go. And every adolescent, will wrestle with these questions either consciously, like discussing it with friends or writing in a journal, or non-consciously, meaning they're still going on. The questioning is still there, but they just go about their lives without having much awareness of those questions. And that's really an interesting issue, because in many ways what research shows is that how you wrestle with those kinds of questions in adolescence sets the stage for the rest of your life. And that's why I wrote the Brainstorm book, because I thought there ought to be a book for adolescents themselves to read, in addition to their parents, of course, but that lays out the science of adolescence so you can actually do something in a positive way to set the stage for the rest of your life.
Well, I think that's, incredibly valuable to parents, to grandparents like me, to the adolescents themselves, because, people have always traditionally dismissed it as, hormones.
Totally. I mean, I've gone all around the world now, after the book is published, and I'll say, what's the main thing about adolescence? And everyone goes, raging hormones.
Yeah.
And it's just not true. Hormones do rise because of puberty, which isn't exactly the same as the beginning of adolescence, but it roughly corresponds to it. And certainly rising hormones that are of a higher level, impact your behavior, your emotions, your mood. Of course, they affect your body. You're sexually maturing. And they give you different feelings, sexual feelings. They can give you all sorts of changes, even in how the brain functions. But they're not raging. And in fact, many of the changes of adolescence that we see, ways you think differently, some of the challenges you have that we can talk about, they're actually not due to raging hormones. And when I've spoken to endocrinologists, I said, okay, in your training as an endocrinologist, a specialist in hormones, what were you told about raging hormones? And they look at me and they go, they don't exist. That is a meaningless term. So there you go.
You're listening to the Inspired Parenting Radio Show. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest is neuropsychiatrist and best-selling author Dr. Daniel Siegel. After the break, Dan will explain why don't do it doesn't do it. He'll also share with us the power of promoting the positive. We'll be back in a few moments, so don't go away.
You're listening to OTR-FM, part of the IOM radio network.
Have you ever wondered how to change your love paradigm? The secret key is finding a love partnership, not just a regular connection. How do you find these? Through conscious relationships. Ascending Hearts Dating is a dating site for people like you that believes in second chances and a different type of spiritual connection. Try Ascending Hearts for free today at ascendinghearts.com and change your love paradigm. Ascending Hearts, the premier dating community for the spiritually awake.
Do you have time to read that inspiring book or that blog post you've been meaning to get to? In your busy world, how do you improve yourself and keep your life going? I'm Lisa Kay, and my Between Heaven and Earth radio show can transform your life just by listening. Be uplifted with inspiring topics, positive stories, and ideas that really work. Between Heaven and Earth Radio is conscious living for your soul, every Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time.
Host your show on IOM-FM, the radio network of OMTimes Media, one of the more recognized brand names in the conscious community, and is backed by the extensive marketing reach of OMTimes. Hosting a show on IOM-FM immediately connects you with our extensive dedicated community.
Hi, this is Angela Levesque, host of Entanglement Radio. Join me Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern for inspiring conversations with visionaries in spiritual science and conscious healing. Entanglement Radio, Wednesdays at 12 p.m. Eastern. Transcendent talk for the conscious mind.
You're listening to OTR-FM, part of the IOM radio network.
Remember when my daughter was a teenager, the things she used to do, and not just once, but again and again and again. And it didn't matter how many times I said don't do it, she would. And when I would say, what, why? She couldn't give me an answer. So what's going on?
Totally. Well, when I was having my own teenagers at home and then later into their 20s, because adolescence doesn't end when you end your 19th year, it actually goes into the mid to late 20s. So with my teens, I had the exact same experience, Sandie, and I wanted to understand, why were they acting this way? What in the world was going on? When I looked at what was around in the popular literature, I was amazed that the raging hormone story was what was usually told, and there would be all these insulting things that would be said about adolescence that, as a parent, I found very unhelpful, and if I were an adolescent reading them, I'd actually find them very troubling, because they're all disempowering. And so when I started looking at not the popular literature, but the science of adolescence that's been coming out in the last 10 years, I was shocked to find that what was now known in science was not available to the public. So I set out to actually write something for adolescents themselves to read, and their parents or teachers or coaches or therapists or anyone who cares for adolescents. And it turns out that even people who once were adolescents, find it very interesting, because they can realize now what was going on then, just like you're describing. How do we explain these things? And if we take apart some of the brain aspects of this, we can actually help ourselves understand how it is that your daughter wouldn't know exactly what was going on. So we can talk about that in detail if you want to.
Yeah, because I'm fascinated by the hyper-rational thinking where they can actually make a positive out of something that we would see as a negative.
Exactly. Well, here's the place to start, I think, is to say that the adolescent period is a period between childhood dependency and adult responsibility. And 150 years ago, the research suggests it was a very short period. So girls would mature around 15 or 16. Boys would mature, somewhere a year or two later. And females, they would get married off about 2 or 3 years later. So the adolescent period was about 2 or 3 years. And after sexually maturing, boys might get married 4 or 5 years later. So always a little bit behind, of course. And so that's just the way it was. But in recent times, for reasons we really don't understand, the onset of puberty, at least, has been much, much younger. So it's not 15 or 16, it's 13, it's 12, for some girls it's 11, some it's 10. Now, it is true that you can start puberty and not be starting adolescence, so they're not exactly the same, but there's a rough correlation between the two. And just in the same way, you can actually have a delayed puberty but still start your adolescence. So what is adolescence all about? Well, adolescence is this time when the brain begins to prune itself down. And it's going to be differentiating areas, so you can specialize in what you're functioning and how you're doing that. And the overall purpose of this, pruning and then the myelination we talked about, the purpose of it is to actually get this person ready to leave home. So when you look at other adolescents, let's say in other animals that are not human, not just primates, but in other animals like gazelles or in dogs, for example, you find that we as a general class of animal, mammals, we actually all have adolescence, that period of time between childhood dependency and adult responsibility. So it isn't just a human invention. And one way we think about it is nature has got to get you ready to leave the nest. Now, here's the story that you mentioned about hyper-rational thinking. Let's say, Sandie, you picture this. You're a little kid. Your mom kisses you good morning. She and your dad get you ready with breakfast for school. You go off to school and have a great day. You come home and you play with your toys. You play with your dog. You go outside, you play. If you have television, maybe you watch some cartoons. They give you dinner. And then you are given a bath. You watch another cartoon. You're really tired. You brush your teeth. Oh, and then you go into bed. And they sing you a song, give you a massage, and read you a story, and off to sleep you go for another beautiful day. Now, if you think about it, who in their right mind would ever give that up? Why would you let that safe and certain and familiar and comfortable home go? So nature needs us to get out in the world. There's lots of reasons for that. But how, if you were nature, Sandie, what would you do to make this child say, I'm giving up what's comfortable, I'm giving up what's familiar, I'm giving up what is certain, and I'm even giving up what's safe so I can become an adolescent and explore the world and get ready to take on adult responsibility? What would you do?
It's got to be some urge that you give them.
You got to do something, some big change, right?
Yeah, something's got to drive that.
So here's what nature does. Nature basically has, it's an essence that I think of. E spells the word essence, E-S-S-E, and then N, and then C-E. 4 things we're going to talk about. The first one, E-S, emotional spark. The nature makes the brain of this adolescent more emotional, and interestingly, the reason for that is emotion evokes motion. That's one way to think about the word even. Emotion means evokes motion, because you got to get this kid ready to get out of this house. The downside of this is you're more moody, right? You're more irritable. You can't predict your emotions, and your emotions shape what you believe, what you think, and how you act. And so here's the story. You are now more emotional, so we need to teach adolescents how to not just avoid their emotions or be swamped by them, but how to surf the waves of their emotions. And so this is where emotional spark, the first part of our essence, is really crucial. And for your daughter, you know, she may have all sorts of emotions that are driving her behavior. And when she says, Mom, I don't know why I did that, she's absolutely right. Because feelings can drive our reasoning and drive our actions without us understanding why. Because most of what goes on actually in the mind is not conscious. We're not aware of it. So she says to you, Mom, I don't know why I did that. Now that brings up the second one, which is SE, social engagement. So the first is emotional spark. It's got a reason to get you more activated. It's got a downside, you're more irritable. It's got an upside, you know, it's passion and energy and all this wonderful vitality. But what's SE? SE is social engagement. And here what nature says to you is, hey, when you leave home, if you don't have some other adolescents that you're associating with, you're going to be somebody's lunch. And so to actually survive, it's a life and death issue. Nature makes it so you're more drawn to people your age. Now, I know when I first felt this as a parent, I felt really rejected. I felt like, oh, my God, what am I doing wrong? My 14-year-old wants to go to a movie with his friends and not with his dad. What have I done wrong? What kind of attachment father am I? You know, all this kind of stuff. Well, the reality is nature is making my son know he's got to associate with his peers and push away, not totally away, but push a bit away from his parents and other adults. So this is why nature is setting it up, and that's the reason for it. What's the downside? You know, I can be so drawn to be a member of other adolescents that I give up morality in order to gain membership, and that's not good. So we want to teach adolescents to develop an internal compass of morality and really knowing their own values so they can make choices, not just be on automatic pilot. And what's the upside is that, you know, all the research shows that your ability to have social networks of support, not just in adolescence, but throughout adulthood and throughout the lifespan, is the best predictor of your medical health, your mental well-being, happiness, and even how long you live. So you learn these skills in a big way during adolescence, and that's social engagement, right? And then you have the next one, which is really going to address what happened with your daughter, and it's N for novelty. What nature does is 2 things. Nature drops the baseline level of a substance in what's called the reward circuitry of your brain. This is the circuitry in your brain that says, hey, I think I'll do this. I'll do action A, and after I do it, I get this squirt of something called dopamine. And when I get a squirt of dopamine in my brain, I go, ooh, that felt good. That was really rewarding. Yeah. Let me do that again. That's great. So now here's the crucial thing. The baseline levels are dropped, so I feel a little utsy and out of sorts and a little restless because I got this low dopamine going around. But then my release levels are higher. Now, one of the things that releases dopamine is novelty. So here I am in that beautiful home. I'm hanging out. I've been here for 10 years, 11 years. Now my dopamine drops, and I got to do something new, meaning get out of the house. So here you see it's not hormones. It's the change in the reward circuitry so that the alterations that nature creates in the dopamine levels make it so the baseline is lower, the release level higher. So now I'm driven to do new things. Now, that's the reason for it, because I need to get out of the house. What's the downside? Well, risk. Adolescents are 2 to 3 times more likely to be permanently injured by an adolescent-caused thing that they did, or even die. So it's a very dangerous period, even though their bodies are stronger than any other time. Physiologically and muscularly, they are actually stronger, yet they're so much at risk for hurting themselves. So that's the downside. The upside is the courage to really go beyond what's comfortable and really check out the world. Now, the nature does one other thing besides change dopamine levels, and it's what you mentioned earlier, Sandie. It's this weird name that I tried to find a more user-friendly name for the book, Brainstorm, but I just couldn't, so I just decided to keep it with what the researchers call it. So I didn't invent this name, and it makes a lot of parents confused because it's a confusing name, but it's called hyper, meaning a lot of rational thinking. And a lot of parents go, hold on, someone's confused. You mean hypo-rational thinking, right? Hypo, meaning less. And I say, no. The term is hyper-rational. They say, well, what do you mean by that? Here's what I mean. And this is a sad, sad story. But
Dan, I'm going to have to stop you there. I want you to hold that thought because this is really important, but we have to go to break. So we're going over to a break now. When we get back, we'll be finishing this particular part of the conversation, and we'll be looking at how do we know whether a teen's seemingly crazy behaviour is normal or something to be concerned about? Plus, sex, drugs and rock and roll. We'll be back in a few moments. Stay tuned.
This is OTR-FM, part of the IOM radio network.
The number one reason girls drop out of school in sub-Saharan Africa is lack of access to feminine hygiene products. The Pads for Schoolgirls Project, an outreach of Humanity Healing International, is changing this paradigm by setting up sewing programs at schools, teaching girls a vocational skill while producing the reusable pads that help keep them attending classes. The girls pay it forward by making and giving pad kits to other girls in need. To learn more, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Do you want to be a better communicator? Do you want to better connect with the important people in your life? Do you want to enrich your relationships? If so, join me, Matthew Cooper, on the Positive Control System Show every Wednesday evening at 11 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time on OMTimes Radio. I'll meet you there.
Host your show on IOM FM, the radio network of OMTimes Media, one of the more recognized brand names in the conscious community, and is backed by the extensive marketing reach of OMTimes. Hosting a show on IOM FM immediately connects you with our extensive dedicated community. Join Elliot Jolish, the business therapist, each Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern for the Elliot Jolish Hour, as he interviews business experts on your behalf. And you're invited to email your business questions to questions@ecjgroup.com for answers, live, on air every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern on the Elliot Jolish Hour.
This is OTR-FM, part of the IOM radio network.
I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'm discussing the teenage brain with neuropsychiatrist and best-selling author Dr. Daniel J. Siegel. Dan, that was a bit of a cliffhanger. Hyper-rational thinking. I mean, it's so fascinating. Please finish what you were saying.
Well, Sandie, and this is a little upsetting, but, when my son was 1 and now he's 26, so 25 years ago, one of my favorite teachers was killed in a car accident when a 19-year-old who had already crashed his car a few months earlier drove about 100 miles an hour on a surface street and just hit my teacher head on in his car. And I told myself, holding my son in my arms when I heard the news, that anything I could do to make it so when this period of impulsivity and this need for speed called adolescence came around, I would have tried to do as much as I could to prevent it so my son wouldn't do something like that, and the people like my wonderful teacher wouldn't be killed. And of course, even for this adolescent, it's not good for him either that he lives the rest of his life knowing that he killed someone. So how can we understand this action, And so looking into the research, this is the way we can view it. Number one, there's this drive to explore novelty because of the dopamine change. But then there's this change in something we call hyper-rational thinking. That's what the researchers call it. Hyper, meaning more, and rational. And what does it mean? So here's what it would mean if we were imagining being in the mind of that 19-year-old before he got in the car and went almost 100 miles an hour and ran into my teacher. So here's what it would be like. First of all, guesses, which are what people believe, would say, oh, he's got raging hormones. Well, we've already said, no, that's not true. They'd say, oh, well, he's impulsive. Well, in the beginning of adolescence, early adolescence, like, 13, 14, 15, yes, impulsivity is there. You act without thinking. But actually, after that early period of adolescence, impulsivity is not the issue, and danger and the risk of being really seriously injured or hurting someone else is still there. So it isn't just impulsivity is the point. Yes, in the beginning, but not later on. So what is it? Well, what they discovered, they said, well, maybe it's that these adolescents aren't informed. So they checked into it, and it turns out, no, many adolescents know of the dangers that they engage in. They know there's a risk. So here's where the hyper-rational part comes in. This boy gets in his car. Maybe his friends are watching, because friends watching or knowing that they will find out about what you did makes this hyper-rational thinking even more intense. And what it means is I rationalize. If I'm him, I'm rationalizing. I've got a brand new car my parents gave me, even though I crashed one a few months ago. I'm in this car. I see the speedometer can go up to 180 miles an hour. This is a really curvy street. Wouldn't it be incredibly thrilling to drive this thing 100 miles an hour? That feels right. And then wouldn't it be great if my friends knew I did it and thought I was so cool? How brave am I that I'd do that? So that's also a positive thing in my mind, right? And then another part of my mind goes, but since you crashed a car 2 months ago, that you could crash into a tree, or you could crash and kill yourself, or you could crash and kill somebody else. And then here's the rational part. What's the chance of that happening? That's like 30% chance. There's a 70% chance that's not going to happen. Now, let's say it's even a 5% chance that something bad would happen. So it's 95% chance that a good outcome will come, good in quotes of nothing bad happening. Well, he's going to overestimate the bad, 30% over the 5%. And then what he does is he only focuses on the positive outcome and dismisses whatever the percentage is, the negative outcome. So in a very rational way, this is what he says. The most likely outcome is that I will drive this car 100 miles an hour down the street and nothing bad will happen. Now, if it's a 70% chance, that's greater than 50%. So it's rational. That is, it's logical, that phrase, the most likely outcome is. And so that's rational. That's why they call it hyper-rational. It makes no sense, I know. I know that. But it's super rational. Now, what we need to do, I think, is understand this. The reason for it is it's the way nature helps you do dangerous things so you can learn about the dangers in the world. What's the downside of it? Of course, is getting killed, killing somebody else, getting permanently injured, or injuring someone else. But what's the upside? Is it gets you out there. Now, how can we help adolescents explore the world and be willing to have the courage to try on new things? That's the novelty part, without getting hurt. And the answer, I think, is by developing what I call an internal compass, getting this boy in touch with his heart, literally the organ of the heart and the intestines. There's a whole neurobiology behind this I won't get into here, but there are exercises in the book. the Brainstorm book. They're called mind-sight exercises. They teach you the sight is to see, the mind is these mental processes like your gut feelings and your heartfelt sense. And if this young man had these mind-sight tools, here's what would happen. He gets in the car. His hyper-rational brain says, I'm going to do this. The most likely outcome is fine. It's good. But then his heart sends signals to his brain that says, this doesn't feel right. His gut says, ooh, I have a gut feeling. So rather than saying, oh, my mommy told me not to go, or looking at the speed sign that says 35 miles per hour limit, and he says, oh, some policeman put that there. That's an adult. I don't listen to adults. None of that brain stuff. Now his own heart, his own intestine will give him the proper guide. It'll be an internal compass. And I think my teacher would have still been alive now if that had been taught.
And that's what you call gist thinking, isn't it?
That's the gist of it. Yeah, the gist is I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
And you know something, if we taught adolescents this, wouldn't it be wonderful to empower them?
Wouldn't it just? Something else I liked, you also said that, okay, this kid's got the need for speed, the thrill. One of the ways the parents could support that is actually, get him engaged in activities that would be safe, that would give him, would satisfy that need for thrilling adventures.
That's exactly right. I mean, you could have him do racing of bicycles. He could actually go to a racetrack if you had the funds. He could go skiing. There's all sorts of things you can do that certainly don't endanger other people and that teach your child the limits of what they could do, And I should make sure we say here, one of the other sad risks of having this dopamine change is not only dangerous behavior, but getting addicted, whether it's to smoking or to other drugs like alcohol or heroin or cocaine. These all involve dopamine. So the fact is that if you're going to develop an addiction, it's most likely to happen the second dozen years of life because of this dopamine change of the reward system. And so that's another, risky thing. So, but if we teach adolescents about all this stuff, you actually can empower them. It's, the story, raging hormones, it's not only wrong, but there's nothing you can do about it, Sandie. If you were an adolescent being told, hey, you're going to have these wild, crazy molecules running around your bloodstream, there's nothing you can do. But what you can do about this is you can learn these skills, which I have all in the gray pages of the book. So there's each section then is followed by gray pages that teach you how to do something positive about it. And then you can do something. And the response from adolescents who've read the book is some of the most amazing responses for me as a writer and as a clinician, because they say, look, my whole life changed because I read this book and I've done the exercises and now I feel like a different person. So it's empowering that they learn this from the inside out, really. And especially if you look at the last thing, creative exploration, you realize that's emotional spark, ES, social engagement, SC, it spells the word S, and N is novelty. The last one is creative exploration. Adolescents are designed, to push against the status quo. We call it rebellion, and, the reason for it, though, is that for an individual to actually make it outside the home, they got to think on their own. But also for our species as a whole, we have to adapt to an ever-changing world. But let's think about it, Sandie. You and I, once we got through adolescence and got to adulthood, what do most of us do? We kind of settle into our niche, and there we are, and we're doing our work, and at the end of the day, we're kind of tired. But the world is forever changing, and the part of our population that is most capable, ready, built for adaptation, for creatively exploring the new world that's emerging, are adolescents. And if you look at some of the most significant creations, whether it's in technology or engineering or science or art or music, they come from adolescent minds. Even Einstein's major ideas came from before he was 26, so he was still an adolescent.
Well, we're seeing so much of this, aren't we? The emergence of the bright young things, the inventors, the creators, the dot-commers. It's just an explosion of creativity.
And we need to find a way to support that
in
a positive way, I think, by guiding adolescents as the adults in the world, say, hey, you are actually the hope for the future. And I think schools don't really take advantage of this. They make, instead of, tapping into the emotional spark of adolescence. They call it pathology and there's some sickness, but it's passion that we need to support. The social engagement, all we do is have adolescents in schools, for the most part, compete with each other rather than compete with the world's problems so that everybody benefits when someone wins. We have them compete with each other, like pulling down the other person. There's only room for one at the top kind of thing. But they're built to collaborate. And the novelty, we have them do the same thing over and over again, and they're bored with school for the most part. And creative exploration, we need to give these adolescents, with the world the way it is, a structured way to deal with their creative exploration, their drive to explore things different from the world they were handed.
I was impressed by the story you related about, teaching kids not to smoke. You don't tell them not to smoke. You actually point out, these companies are run by businessmen who just want to get your money. You just approach it from a different angle. And I think that's true, in many, many topics with kids. If you can approach it from a completely different angle, you'll have success.
Totally. And it's like what you said before the break, saying don't do it doesn't do it, is how I say it in Brainstorm. The idea is this, we as adults often treat adolescents like they're children, and they're not. They're not immature adults, so it's not a period of immaturity. It's a necessary period of adolescent remodeling that actually, when you think about it, if you deeply understand everything we're talking about, your approach as an adult to an adolescent that's in your life, or if you're an adolescent listening to this, your approach even to yourself and your friends, it becomes totally different. And this is what, for me has been so rewarding, going to schools, middle schools and high schools, and teaching adolescents directly, and then teaching the faculty and the parents in the schools, because once everyone has a different conversation going with mutual understandings based on science, everything has changed and people become empowered. Everyone benefits.
Absolutely, and that's what it should be about. You're listening to the Inspired Parenting Radio Show. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'm talking about the teenage brain with neuropsychiatrist and best-selling author Daniel SIEGEL. We'll be back in a few moments after the break.
This is OTR-FM, part of the IOM radio network.
OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
The name is Bond. James Bond.
No, the name is Joe, The Joe Show. And we are returning back for our 9th season here on OMTimes Radio. So tune in every Wednesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, on OMTimes.com/mobile. You can take us wherever you go. Yeah!
Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Hello, I'm Miriam Knight of New Consciousness Review, inviting you to my new show where I interview the rising stars of the conscious awakening. We'll explore the many faces of consciousness and action and intriguing perspectives on life, the universe, and everything in between. Join us each Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern on the Rising Stars Show.
This is OTR-FM, part of the IOM radio network.
Dan, we didn't get a chance to discuss this one, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because there's lots to fit into this last segment. But I am a little bit concerned about the issue of how do we know whether a teen's seemingly crazy behaviour is normal or something to be concerned about? Because you do write that, you know, sometimes the pruning that goes on can unmask some problems.
Well, Sandie, you're asking these really important foundational questions for all of us, adolescents and adults alike. So let's start with what the science tells us. You know, if you are going to develop a major psychiatric disorder, we mentioned addiction as one of those, but it's also other disorders like a mood disorder, like depression or what's called bipolar disorder or manic depressive illness, obsessive-compulsive disorder, anxiety disorders of all sorts. If you're going to develop schizophrenia, where you have some difficulty thinking clearly and get sometimes disconnected from your emotions, or other disorders as well, eating disorders, for example, it's most likely to have its onset during the second dozen years of life, during adolescence. Now, in the old days, of course, what people would say is, oh, yeah, that's raging hormones. Well, we know it's not the hormone story, so what is it? Well, it could be that pruning is at the heart of this. Now, what does that mean? It means that when your brain begins to remove some of the connections that exist, that the way you were before adolescence, let's say you need 1,000 of these basic neurons connected to each other to keep your mood stable, let's just say. And let's say in adolescence, just to do the numbers, you remove half, okay? So let's say you happen to be someone with 1,500 of those neurons, and your friends all have, 6,000. So you're able to control your mood because all you need is 1,000, and you've got 1,500. That's fine. Your friends have 6,000. They can control their mood too. All good. You now all go through adolescence. Well, you go from 1,500, and half of that is 750. Your friends go from 6,000 to 3,000. So now you can't control your mood. So if things get tough, you get really irritable, and then your mood starts to swing, and maybe you're developing manic depressive illness. So you've now gone to 750, but here's the tough reality. We believe that increased stress, not getting enough sleep, having too much anxiety, actually increases the pruning. So you don't just go to 750. Now your own what's called dysregulation creates more cortisol levels, this hormone that rises, stress hormone that does lead to more pruning. And then you're down to 500, now you're 400, now you're 300, and your mood is really way out of control. Your friends are at 3,000. They've remained with their mood stable. They're not having the stress you are. They're sleeping well. Everything's fine. Maybe they have stresses of everyday adolescence, and that increases the pruning a little bit, so they go to 2,500. But they're still way over the 1,000 level that they need. So here's the sad reality is that once you develop a major form of disturbance to your well-being, it actually, during adolescence especially, because any period of growth and remodeling is a period of vulnerability. That's the way to think about it from a scientific point of view. So even though these periods of growth and remodeling are opportunities, they're also vulnerabilities. And this is where we need to be all over this. And the why I wanted to make this book available to adolescents is because all of the disorders, as far as I can tell, from the different overview of the research that I've done, involve impairments to integration. So the mindsight skills you learn in the Brainstorm book actually teach you as an adolescent, or if you do them as an adult, how to integrate your brain. So, studies are being done now at Stanford, UCLA, to see if you can do similar kinds of approaches. They're called mindfulness meditation approaches, where you can actually try to keep the brain integrated and maybe even grow integrative fibers. These fibers that link the widely separated areas to each other are the fibers that are responsible for what's called regulation. Self-regulation means regulating your mood, your emotions, your thinking, your behavior, your attention. All that stuff comes from integration. So we want to do anything we can to really help. Now, you're asking the question, when is it a psychiatric disorder? Well, a disorder, by definition, is when a person's become dysfunctional. not just giving you a hard time as a parent, because that's what adolescents are built to do. It's when they're really not functional anymore in a number of settings like home and at school. And so any of these disorders can have their onset, and early intervention, meaning early assessment, determining what's going on, giving proper psychotherapy if that's necessary. Sometimes it's medications, sometimes it's meditation. We did a study of adolescents and adults with meditation, with attention problems, for example, and we got excellent improvements. A follow-up study needs to be done to confirm that, but that's the initial findings. And so what we're trying to say here is that if you are really concerned as a parent that whether it's emotions being out of control or thoughts not staying clear, or your child is suicidal because they're so despairing, or they're using drugs, or they're having an eating disorder, then going to a mental health professional, if you're concerned, is a good idea. You can start with your pediatrician or your family doctor, tell them you're concerned, and get an evaluation. And when you get a professional, they can distinguish between, adolescent challenges and psychiatric disorder.
Okay, so let's assume that, we've got a kid that is just doing the normal, challenging, doing what he should be doing, and things get out of hand. How do we repair potential ruptures in our relationship?
Yeah, well, Sandie, I love talking to you. These questions are like the cornerstones of excellent parenting. It's so wonderful to be on the line with you. This is great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Here's the way to think about it. There's no relationship that's perfect. And I think part of why I write in all the parenting books I've written, including Brainstorm, or what I wrote with Tina Bryson or Mary Hartzell, I always put in my bloopers as a parent because I want parents to realize there's no such thing as perfect parenting. There is absolutely no such thing as it. You can have a direction you're aiming for, but we always deviate from that direction. And then when you deviate and a rupture happens in your connection with your child or your spouse or yourself or anything, you want to take the time to take a deep breath, realize you're human, be kind and loving to yourself as a starting place. And then, once you've reached this place of I think I'm ready with a sense of calmness, you go back to let's say it's your adolescent, and you say, I'd like to talk to you about what happened an hour ago, 10 minutes ago, 1 minute ago, this morning, whenever it was. It's never too late to make a repair. And make a repair. Say, I started yelling at you when you told me you wanted to go to that party for the 5th time, and I blew my top, and I'm sorry I blew my top, but, I don't feel comfortable going to a party where there's no adult supervising. And I understand, you really want to go, but I just want to say I'm sorry I shouldn't have screamed and yelled at you and said the things I did. Now, your adolescent may say, I really need to go, because all my cool friends are going to be there, and if I don't go, they're not going to think I'm cool. And then you could say something like this. I was reading this book, or I heard, or I was listening to Sandie's show, and I know that being connected with your peers can feel like life and death. And I really respect that. And I understand you're a mammal, and that's part of our mammalian heritage, and you're a human being, so you really want to be at these parties. I get that, and I really do. But I also know that when there's no adult present, adolescents can act in ways that are hyper-rational and driven by this dopamine change. So let's work this out together. How can you get what you need, and I get what I need, which is to make sure you're going to be safe? Let's problem solve together, and then you do. And with my kids, we would have a conversation literally like this, before I knew the details of the dopamine business, because they weren't known then. But we would talk about it, how can we work this out together? Because being the parent of an adolescent is a different kind of dialogue. Making repairs is essential, but also reaching out to them and starting to teach them that you can be present, even for things that make you upset, and that you can problem solve with them to think about the big picture. Because ultimately what you're doing is you're teaching them life skills. And that's the whole idea of parenting from birth onward.
Dan, you wouldn't believe the size of the document that I prepared for tonight with all of the things that I wanted to discuss with you, and we just don't have the time. But I want our listeners to know your book goes into so many great areas. It talks about attachment, the importance of attachment, recognizing our own attachment profile, if you like, and how we can work with that, all of the Mindsight tools, and practices and the Mindsight Simple 7. And we don't have time to talk about them. Will you come back another time?
Sandie, I'd be happy to. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Dr. Daniel Siegel, thank you for joining us. What can I say? It's been a tremendous pleasure, and I look forward to the next time.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, for more information about Dr. Daniel Siegel, his Mindsight book, the tools, the practices, you can visit his website at Dr. Dan, D-A-N, Siegel, SIEGEL.com. The Inspired Parenting Radio Show is brought to you by inspiredparenting.com, and I invite you to visit the website, check out the free articles, along with the many benefits of subscribing to our online magazine and our quarterly print journal. That's inspiredparentingmagazine.com. Next week, I'll be discussing how to raise joyful children in a stressful world with author of the Happy Kid Handbook, Katie Hurley. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. Thanks for being with me today. I look forward to being with you at the same time next week. Till then, it's goodbye from me.